unfold.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take a stack of dense sources, tear them apart, and put them back together so you walk away truly well-informed. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive that it looks not just at disruption, but at potential societal dismantling. We have been handed a comprehensive simulation report detailing the recurrence of a supersolar storm, a scenario chillingly nicknamed the digital apocalypse.
It's perhaps the most sobering material we've ever reviewed, because it forces us to confront a fragility we usually just ignore. Our core mission today is to aggressively challenge the modern presumption of technological continuity. I mean, we assume the power and the internet will always be there, but this research demonstrates just how tenuous that assumption really is. Back in 1859, the Carrington Event caused sparks and fires in the relatively primitive telegraph system. Today, a similar event wouldn't just cause a disruption, it would fundamentally dismantle the entire technological substrate. And that leads to a catastrophe measured in years, not days or weeks.
That distinction, years, not days, that is absolutely crucial because when most people hear solar storm, they worry about their cell phones or maybe their computers getting fried.
And that is the core thesis we need to abandon right now, immediately. The primary threat isn't the direct frying of your consumer electronics. It's the synergistic, cascading collapse of two monumental physical systems. First, the high-voltage electric power grid, and second, the global submarine cable network. And the root cause of this dual failure is the overwhelming brute force of geomagnetically induced currents, or GICs. If we lose the backbone of electricity and the major intercontinental cables, the global internet simply ceases to function. It's a systemic collapse, not a component failure.
Okay, so let's unpack this with the underlying physics, because the discussion really begins with the sun itself. The sources are extremely clear on this. Space weather events are not freaks of nature or, black swans. They are intrinsic predictable physics.
That is the foundation of our understanding here. The sun is a magnetic variable star. It is a constantly churning ball of plasma and magnetic fields. And we, Earth, we orbit deep inside its fluctuating dynamic magnetic environment. So the question is not if a superstorm will hit us, but when it will inevitably align with Earth. The research demands we treat this as an inevitable, predictable risk.
And the benchmark for any worst-case planning is, of course, the event observed by astronomers Richard Carrington and Richard Hobson on September 1st, 1859. Why was that specific event so devastating? I mean, what aligned to make it the most powerful solar storm in recorded history?
Well, it was defined by a specific combination of factors that maximized both the storm's velocity and its magnetic impact on our planet. The first factor is what the researchers term the double tap mechanism. A typical coronal mass ejection, or CME, that's 1 billion tons of magnetized plasma, it takes maybe 3 or 4 days to travel the 150 million kilometers from the sun to Earth. That speed allows our magnetosphere time to absorb and deflect some of that energy.
But the 1859 event was different. It traveled incredibly fast.
Yes, and that's where this double tap comes in. The main massive September 1st CME was preceded just a couple of days earlier, on August 29, by a smaller preparatory storm. That initial storm acted precisely like a snowplow, sweeping away the ambient solar wind plasma that normally sits between the sun and Earth.
So it created a low-density vacuum, a clear lane.
Exactly. When the main shockwave erupted, it traveled through this rarefied vacuum unimpeded, reducing drag dramatically. The result was that the CME reached Earth in a staggering 17.6 hours. It was an interplanetary speed record.
And that speed is the critical factor for energy, right? The old E = mc squared. If you double the speed, you quadruple the kinetic energy it delivers.
That's the critical physics. The sources confirm this velocity likely exceeded 3,000 kilometers per second. When that much mass hits our magnetosphere at that speed, it transfers an exponentially higher amount of kinetic energy. It hits like a hypervelocity projectile rather than a soft push. But, velocity alone is not enough. We needed the second critical factor, the magnetic orientation, specifically the B-Silsen component.
Let's stick with the physics for just a moment. What is this BA factor the report emphasizes? And why is its orientation the definitive marker of a catastrophic impact?
So, BA describes the direction of the magnetic field contained within the plasma cloud of the CME itself. Think of Earth's magnetic field as a giant northward pointing shield. If the magnetic field carried by the incoming CME also points northward, well, the two fields repel each other and the storm largely bounces off. But the Carrington CME possessed a strong, sustained, southward pointing BLR component.
So the southward field of the storm pulls against the northward field of the Earth.
Precisely. When they collide, they don't repel. They violently connect through a process called magnetic reconnection. You can visualize it as a massive cosmic zipper being ripped open. It effectively tears a temporary, vast hole in our geomagnetic shield, allowing terawatts of solar wind energy along with high-energy particles to pour directly down into the polar and high-latitude atmosphere. And this immense induced electric field is what creates the GICs that will later dismantle the grid.
And we can bring that abstract physics down to Earth by looking at the impact on the 19th century telegraph network. It's an amazing historical case study because those operators were the first people to, I guess, violently harness solar power.
Indeed. The effects were immediate and globally synchronized. The aurora, usually confined to the far north, was seen as far south as Cuba and Colombia. And as that induced current flowed through the long, conductive telegraph lines, it just overloaded the systems. The most memorable anecdote involves operators in Boston and Portland, Maine, who, seeing the lights, disconnected their battery banks entirely. And then they proceeded to transmit messages for 2 hours using only the induced current, what they called the celestial power.
That sounds incredible, but the power wasn't exactly benign.
No, not at all. In other stations, the raw power was destructive. Reports from across the U.S. and Europe describe streams of fire erupting from relay keys, paper documents spontaneously igniting on desks, and platinum contacts fusing together due to the intense heat and arcsing. The sheer scale of the telegraph network meant it became a massive kilometer-spanning antenna channeling solar energy directly into the stations, proving the destructive capability of GICs even 160 years ago.
Now, we have to address this notion that the 1859 event was some kind of millennial rarity. The research validates that the threat is much more frequent, and we narrowly missed a modern digital apocalypse just over a decade ago.
The 2012 near miss is the single most compelling piece of evidence we have. On July 23, 2012, a super CME, confirmed by analysis to be fully comparable in magnitude to the 1859 event, tore right through Earth's orbit. If the eruption had occurred just 9 days earlier, when the sun's rotation would have aligned the CME with Earth, we would have been hit head-on.
And how were scientists able to confirm its severity if it missed us?
Well, fortunately, the Stereo A spacecraft was perfectly positioned to capture the entire force of the shockwave. The data validated all the key characteristics of a superstorm. Its velocity was measured at that critical 3,000 kilometers per second, confirming the speed factor. More critically, the magnitude of its magnetic field was measured to be twice as strong as the storm that later collapsed the Quebec power grid in 1989. It was a true Carrington-class event.
So, scientifically, we have validated that these events are happening now, and we know exactly what a hit would look like.
Yes, and Daniel Baker, a leading space weather expert, put it bluntly. If it had hit, we would still be picking up the pieces. The cost modeling based on that 2012 data projected an economic impact exceeding $2 trillion, with a recovery timeline of between 4 and 10 years based solely on the time required to repair the physical damage to infrastructure.
And if we look at the frequency, what does the statistical risk profile suggest? I mean, we can't just live hoping for another 1,000 years of luck.
Statistically, we are rolling the dice with increasing frequency. While the sun follows an 11-year cycle, the most extreme storms often occur during the declining phase of that cycle. That's when conditions favor these high-speed, fast transit CMEs. Research suggests the decadal probability, the chance of a Carrington-level event occurring over the next 10 years, is alarmingly high, ranging from 1.6% at the low end to 12% at the high end.
12% over a decade. That sounds far too high for a catastrophic, multi-trillion-dollar existential threat.
It is a significant statistical risk. Furthermore, if you analyze the estimated return period for these extreme solar storms, it is calculated to be between 150 and 250 years. Given that 166 years have passed since the 1859 event, the sources conclude we are statistically entering a critical risk window for recurrence. We are, to put it simply, overdue.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because we have to move from solar physics to physical engineering. We established that the internet is entirely dependent on physical electricity. Therefore, the death of the internet starts not with a hacker, but with the annihilation of the electric grid.
That is the foundation of the digital apocalypse. Every piece of digital infrastructure, every cell tower, fiber repeater, router, and data center is downstream of the extra high voltage, or EHV, grid. If that grid fails for years, all downstream technology fails with it.
So let's detail the specific mechanism of destruction in the electric grid, these geomagnetically induced currents, or GICs. How exactly does that magnetic energy 90 million miles away translate into destroying a power substation on the ground?
It is a massive application of Faraday's law of induction. When the solar storm hits, the rapid fluctuation of Earth's magnetic field, known as dBdt, induces an electric field in conductive materials on the ground. In the 19th century, the conductor was the telegraph wire. Today, our most efficient conductors are the massive, miles-long 𝐏𝐻V transmission lines that crisscross the continent. They act as absolutely enormous antennae, just harvesting this induced current.
And the sources emphasize that local geology makes this problem uniquely acute in certain parts of the world, specifically North America and Northern Europe.
This is a crucial, often overlooked layer of vulnerability. To complete the circuit, the induced current needs to flow back into the Earth. Ideally, the Earth itself acts as a massive conductor. However, in regions like the Canadian Shield, the U.S. Northeast, and Scandinavia, the geology is dominated by highly resistive igneous and metamorphic rock. This material is a very poor conductor of electricity.
So the current is forced to seek the path of least resistance elsewhere?
Correct. Instead of flowing harmlessly through the resistive rock, the induced current, which is essentially a quasi-direct current, or GIC, is forced onto the low-resistance man-made infrastructure. It finds the metallic pathways of buried pipes, railway lines, and, most importantly, the grounded neutral points of the high-voltage transmission system.
And the grid's Achilles heel is identified as the large power transformers, or LPTs.
The LPTs are the bottleneck and the system's fatal flaw. They are designed exclusively to handle pure alternating current AC at 50 or 60 hertz. The incoming GICs, however, are essentially direct current DC flowing through the ground neutral. This DC bias is instantaneously incompatible with the transformer's core operations.
Why is that DC current so fundamentally destructive to an AC device? Can you walk us through the process of failure? Is it instantaneous?
It's destructive because DC current fundamentally compromises the magnetic core. The destruction happens rapidly, in sequence. The first phase is DC injection, where the GIC enters the ground neutral and biases the magnetic core, shifting its operating curve. Transformers rely on cycling magnetic flux back and forth, but the DC push prevents that.
Okay, and what happens next?
The second phase is half-cycle saturation. During one half of the AC sine wave cycle, the magnetic field inside the core gets pushed past its design limit and it saturates. The core can no longer contain the magnetic flux necessary to regulate the voltage.
So the magnetic energy, the flux, it just spills out.
Exactly. That leads to the third phase, flux leakage. Instead of being contained within the laminated steel core, the magnetic flux spills out wildly into the surrounding structural steel components, the heavy steel tank walls, the clamping mechanisms, the tie plates. This stray flux then induces massive, uncontrolled eddy currents inside that steel structure.
And those eddy currents translate directly into heat.
The final, fatal phase is destruction. The stray flux induces localized, rapid heating, creating hotspots in the structural steel. These hotspots can reach temperatures far exceeding design specifications, leading to the thermal breakdown of the transformer's internal components. The cellulose insulation degrades, the insulating oil gasifies, and physical melting of the conductors begins inside the unit. This is an irreversible physical burnout that renders the transformer completely useless, and this failure occurs in minutes, often before operators can react.
This sounds far more violent and final than the 1989 𝐏𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐒vh collapse, which is the previous gold standard for a geomagnetic storm hitting a grid.
That distinction is absolutely vital for you to grasp. The 1989 storm was significant, roughly half the strength of the 1859 event. When it hit Quebec, the GICs caused saturation, which generated severe waveform distortion harmonics. These distorted waves tricked the protective relays into believing a massive short circuit existed. The grid's safety protocols worked. The system shut itself down in 90 seconds.
So the equipment was saved because it was a protection trip.
Exactly. It was a procedural failure that saved the hardware. The grid was back up within hours. A Carrington-level event, however, is so powerful that the physical melting, the hotspots, and the internal destruction occur before those protective relays can even determine what is happening, much less trip the system. The failure is component-level and permanent, not temporary and procedural.
And this brings us to the absolutely terrifying part of the sources, the supply chain trap.
Yeah.
If hundreds of these LPTs are destroyed simultaneously, the outage duration shifts from hours to years. Wow.
This is the existential fragility inherent in hyperoptimization. LPTs, those massive 100 to 400 ton units, are not standardized off-the-shelf components. They are custom-engineered behemoths, often specifically tailored for the voltage, geological conditions, and phase arrangements of a specific substation. They are bespoke industrial products, and they are not stockpiled.
And their manufacturing time is already measured in years, right?
In current global market conditions, the lead time for a new LPT has ballooned to between 120 and 210 weeks, which is 2.5 to 4 years. This delay is due to the enormous raw material and specialized labor requirements, and the fragility is compounded by a specific bottleneck, the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓 crisis.
Grain-oriented electrical steel.
This is the specialized high-purity steel required for the core laminations. The material is difficult to manufacture, and the sources note a shocking fact. The United States has only one primary domestic producer of 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓 AK steel. This critical component, vital for energy infrastructure, is a single point of failure in the national supply chain.
And if we look globally, our import dependency becomes a catastrophe multiplier.
It locks us into the global geopolitical consequences of the disaster. The U.S. imports approximately 82% of its large power transformers. If a global superstorm hits, every major exporting nation, China, Germany, South Korea, Japan, will instantly nationalize its remaining production capacity. They will prioritize repairing their own grids. The export market for LPTs will freeze overnight.
So if the U.S. needs 500 new transformers, it's not just waiting in a long line, it's waiting in a line that doesn't exist anymore.
Precisely. We lose access to the global supply chain at the moment of maximum need. The consequence is that critical infrastructure hubs Data Center Alley in Northern Virginia, the financial processing centers in New York and Chicago, would lose grid power for durations measured in years. This would completely exhaust their limited emergency diesel reserves many, many times over. The failure of the grid is the guaranteed prerequisite for a multi-year economic and digital freeze.
So what does this multi-year grid outage mean for the actual architecture of the internet? We need to address the common, sort of comforting misconception that because the internet runs on light through glass fiber, it's immune. The sources confirm that the fiber itself is safe, but the active electronics, they are decidedly not.
That's the crucial pivot. The internet is active, not passive. The light signals traveling through the glass must be amplified and regenerated every few miles. And if the grid dies, the machines that push the light through the glass die first.
Let's start with the profound vulnerability of the global submarine cable network. How does a massive submerged cable become susceptible to solar weather?
It's due to the dependence on optical repeaters. Over a transoceanic distance, the light signal loses power. To maintain signal integrity, small amplifiers or repeaters must be placed every 50 to 150 kilometers along the cable route on the ocean floor. These repeaters are electronic components, and they must be powered.
And that power runs the entire length of the cable.
Correct. The repeater power is delivered by a dedicated copper conductor running alongside the fiber strands. This is the power feed equipment, or PFE, grounded at the cable landing stations on both continents. That entire metallic structure, spanning thousands of kilometers across the Atlantic or Pacific, acts as a colossal dipole antenna for the induced GIC.
So the cable essentially short circuits across the ocean floor.
The GIC induces a voltage potential between the continental grounds. This induced voltage adds directly to the PFE's existing operating voltage. If the solar storm is severe enough, the total voltage exceeds the PFE's safety tolerance. Safety mechanisms trip, or worse, dielectric breakdown occurs in the repeaters. Since a single repeater failure can darken the entire line, and a major cable contains hundreds of these sensitive electronics, the failure probability in a Carrington scenario approaches 100%.
And this results in what the sources call the internet partition.
Absolutely. The research clearly indicates that the induced voltage is highest at high magnetic latitudes. This means the North Atlantic, the crucial connection between the high-volume data centers in North America and the major financial and administrative hubs of Northern Europe and the UK, lies in the highest risk zone. A superstorm would likely sever all major transatlantic communication routes simultaneously.
So the global World Wide Web, as we know it, would just cease to exist.
It would fracture instantly. We would be left with regional intranets.
South America might still be connected to Africa, and Asia might maintain internal connectivity, but the capacity to cross the major high-latitude oceans would be eliminated for months or years, at least until specialized deep-sea cable ships could locate and repair all the failed repeaters.
Even if some connectivity survives, the massive data centers that host the services, the cloud that runs banking, healthcare, and communication, still needs to function. The sources talk about the fallacy of their redundancy systems. Data centers are designed for resilience, but only against local failures. They have N+1 or 2 and redundancy for power, cooling, and network, but that architecture is useless against a simultaneous regional grid collapse lasting for months or years. Their vulnerability is rooted in two immediate physical crises.
The first being the quality of power, even before it goes out entirely.
Exactly. When the GICs start hitting the grid, they don't immediately cause a blackout. They cause severe harmonic distortion. That distortion confuses uninterruptible power supplies, or UPS systems, which require clean, stable AC power. The harmonics cause the rectifiers to trip the system, rejecting the grid power and switching prematurely to their internal battery backup. This prematurely exhausts the only power buffer they have.
And the second crisis is the heat. Even if the servers stay on battery, the data center rapidly becomes an oven.
The cooling crisis is immediate. Modern data centers consume a massive amount of power just for their HVAC systems. These cooling plants, chillers, fans, air handlers are far too power intensive to run long-term on generator support. Without industrial-scale cooling, internal temperatures rapidly exceed operating limits. Servers are programmed to initiate thermal shutdown sequences, and the data center will effectively switch itself off in minutes to prevent permanent physical damage to the processors and memory chips.
But the true systemic failure mode is the diesel cliff. Most centers have reserves for only 2 or 3 days. How does the entire logistics chain fail so quickly?
The problem is a circular dependency across three critical infrastructures that all rely on the EHV grid. You need diesel for the generators, but how does the diesel get there? First, refineries. They need massive grid power to crack crude oil into diesel. Second, pipelines. They need massive electric pumps running along their length to move the fuel. And third, distribution. Gas station pumps and refinery distribution hubs need electricity to operate. The trucks delivering the fuel need fuel themselves.
So the entire supply chain freezes.
In a widespread grid-down scenario, yes, it freezes. No new fuel can be refined or distributed. The data centers, the cloud, literally evaporate when they burn through their 72 hours of diesel, and the system cannot be refilled.
The scale of this collapse is not limited to terrestrial infrastructure. The severity of a Carrington event extends violently into the exosphere, creating a hostile environment that specifically targets our reliance on low Earth orbit constellations and, most critically, the global metronome provided by GPS.
Exactly. Let's start with the Starlink scenario. These LEO satellites orbit at a relatively low altitude, around 550 kilometers, making them extremely susceptible to changes in atmospheric density.
They are inherently vulnerable to atmospheric drag.
Right. The mechanism begins when the storm hits. The massive influx of UV and X-ray energy heats the Earth's thermosphere. Heating causes expansion. The atmosphere literally puffs up, ballooning significantly. Instead of ending around 500 kilometers, the dense part of the atmosphere can push up dramatically, perhaps to 600 or even 800 kilometers.
So the satellite, which was previously flying in a near vacuum, suddenly finds itself hitting denser air.
Precisely. This dramatically increases atmospheric drag. We already saw a vivid, albeit minor, example of this in the February 2022 case study. A relatively small geomagnetic storm caused an almost 50% increase in drag. This resulted in 40 newly launched Starlink satellites failing to reach their intended orbit. They experienced too much drag, couldn't maneuver, and deorbited and burned up within days.
I remember that. And if a minor storm did that, the Carrington extrapolation must be terrifying.
It is orders of magnitude stronger. A superstorm would cause a far more violent and prolonged atmospheric expansion. The research modeling suggests that a significant percentage, maybe 40% to 80% of the entire global LEO constellation, including Starlink, OneWeb, and others, would experience catastrophic orbital decay and deorbit within days or weeks. We would lose the entire space-based internet layer just as the terrestrial grid and cables are failing.
This also involves a critical debate in satellite construction. The difference between hardening and tolerance, particularly in these new space commercial designs.
Yes. Older military and high-cost scientific hardware is radiation-hardened, meaning it uses physical shielding specialized components and materials designed to block the radiation, protecting the sensitive electronics. Modern new space ventures, prioritizing cost and speed, use commercial off-the-shelf or COTS components. These are radiation-tolerant.
And tolerance relies on software correction, not physical defense. It's like software armor versus physical armor.
Exactly. COTS rely on software to detect and correct bit flips errors caused by background radiation. But a superstorm delivers a massive, focused dose of high-energy particles that overwhelm software defenses. The most immediate threat is the single event effect, or C. This is when a single hyperenergetic particle, a proton or an electron accelerated by the solar shock wave, strikes a microchip. This causes an immediate, localized electrical surge, leading to an instantaneous latch-up or permanent burnout. Without physical shielding, commercial satellites are highly vulnerable to these immediate, catastrophic failures.
Now, let's move to the ultimate hidden killer, GPS timing failure. If a massive storm hits, why does the world's most precise clock stop working?
UPS GNSS is the invisible metronome of global society, synchronizing everything from financial markets to telecommunications networks. The failure mechanism is the ionospheric delay. When the storm tears open our magnetic shield, terawatts of energy dump into the ionosphere, making it turbulent, highly charged, and extremely dense with electrons.
And the GPS signal has to pass through that mess.
It does. The signal's transit speed is delayed as it passes through this dense, turbulent medium. Since GPS calculates distance, and therefore time, based on the time of flight of that signal, a delay translates directly to a timing error at the ground receiver. The timing accuracy plummets.
So if the GPS timing fails, is it like trying to conduct a massive orchestra where every instrument has a slightly different clock? The data is completely incoherent?
That is an excellent analogy. In telecommunications, especially 4G and 5G cellular networks, we rely on microsecond precision timing to manage time division multiplexing, or TDM. This is how cell towers organize data packets into tiny assigned time slots for transmission. If the timing signal drifts by just a few microseconds, the network becomes desynchronized. Cell towers begin broadcasting data into each other's time slots, packets collide, and the entire network becomes incoherent and unusable, even if the tower still has battery power. The digital synchronization layer of global commerce simply vanishes.
And here is the real-world consequence for you, the listener. We've established the technical failure. Now we transition to the immediate societal shock, starting with the instantaneous paralysis of the global financial system.
The financial freeze is immediate, and it's self-inflicted, driven by regulation, not just technical inability. High-frequency trading algorithms, which drive market liquidity, rely on nanosecond precision and GPS time stamping. When the GPS timing signal is corrupted, the system cannot trust the order of events.
And why is that order of events so critical?
Because global finance is strictly regulated. Regulations like MiFID II in Europe and FINRA rules in the US mandate extreme clock synchronization, often within 100 microseconds, to ensure market integrity and prevent manipulative practices. When the storm hits, the GPS timing corruption means data feeds arrive with inaccurate, unreliable timestamps.
And the exchanges are programmed to just halt under those conditions.
Exactly. The matching engines at the NYSE, NASDAQ, LSE, and others are programmed to trigger automatic kill switches and halt trading if data cannot be accurately timestamped or if the feeds are out of sequence. This simulation shows a synchronized, automated, and indefinite suspension of capital markets globally. This is not a 15-minute technical glitch. It is the instantaneous freezing of the mechanism for pricing assets and transferring capital.
And without capital markets, companies cannot even begin to fund their emergency response.
The liquidity crisis is immediate. Companies that would normally access short-term credit to purchase emergency fuel or pay repair crews cannot do so. Cash flow stops. The entire system of modern commerce, built on debt and rapid transactions, stops dead before the lights even go out for good.
And then we shift to the just-in-time collapse. This is where the modern economy's hyper-efficiency, praised for decades, becomes lethal due to zero buffer.
The JIT logistics model means urban centers operate with extreme density but virtually no buffer against supply interruption. We already discussed the diesel cliff, but now we link that directly to food security. The movement of food relies on fuel, but the coordination relies entirely on high-availability digital logistics, SAP, Oracle, and other enterprise resource planning systems, all of which require the grid and the internet.
What is the buffer for cities? How long do we have?
Cities hold, on average, approximately 3 days of food inventory. This includes grocery stores, warehouses, and distribution hubs. Without the digital logistics network to route trucks and without the fuel network to power those trucks, major urban centers face total food insecurity within 96 hours. The modern city is fundamentally an unsustainable concentration of population without instantaneous digital supply chains.
The sources, however, identify an even more immediate and profound threat to human life than starvation: the collapse of water and sanitation.
This is the hygiene and public health collapse. Modern water infrastructure requires constant, high-power electric pumping to maintain pressure and move water up into high-rise buildings. More critically, sewage only flows downhill for a short distance before it requires lift stations to pump it to the treatment plants. These lift stations run on grid electricity, and their small backup generators are only rated for 24 to 48 hours.
So the sewage stops moving and water pressure drops.
The backflow crisis begins. When the lift stations fail, sewage rapidly backs up into the residential plumbing, into basements, and then into city streets and waterways. This creates an immediate and widespread vector for waterborne diseases, cholera, typhoid, and dysentery in highly concentrated populations. This collapse of sanitation is the primary immediate killer in this scenario.
And the grid failure creates a lethal irony, the boil water paradox.
Yes. Authorities will inevitably issue boil water advisories because the water treatment plants, which also rely on massive electric pumps and digital control systems, will have failed, meaning the remaining water is unsafe. However, residents in modern, dense apartment buildings, which are usually all electric, have no grid power to boil that water, even if they can get it out of a trickle from their taps. The recommended public health solution is rendered impossible by the infrastructure failure.
Finally, let's examine healthcare. Hospitals are required to have backup power, but for a multi-year outage, the system immediately fails.
The ability to practice modern medicine is dependent on an uninterrupted supply chain and digital information. We immediately enter the imaging dark age. High-voltage medical devices like MRI, CT, and advanced X-ray machines often exceed the capacity of standard backup generators or require specialized cooling that fails instantly. And even if an image could be taken, the picture archiving and communication systems, or PACS, that store and transmit those images are entirely network dependent.
And the critical information that keeps patients safe is just locked away.
The record lockout is a catastrophic patient safety crisis. Electronic health records (EHRs) become inaccessible. Doctors lose all access to patient histories, complex drug interaction data, allergies, and current treatment plans. Furthermore, the just-in-time pharmacy supply chain collapses instantly. Pharmacies cannot verify prescriptions, and critical medications like insulin, chemotherapy drugs, and specialized antibiotics cannot be distributed, cutting off access to life-saving treatment globally.
Okay, let's tie all this together with the simulation timeline. This narrative structure is the most visceral way for you to understand the speed and the cascading horror of this collapse.
This timeline synthesizes everything we've discussed: the physics, the grid failure, the internet fracture, and the societal collapse into a cohesive, high-fidelity narrative. It highlights just how quickly the world changes.
The clock starts at T-minus 18 hours. CME detected.
A massive X-class flare erupts, and space weather observatories detect the CME moving at that terrifying 3,200 kilometers per second. Warnings are issued to utility companies, but the transit time less than 18 hours gives grid operators agonizingly little time to execute planned shutdown procedures.
T0, the moment of impact.
The shockwave hits the Earth's magnetosphere. Immediately, GPS position errors spike wildly, rendering precise navigation impossible. High-frequency radio blackouts occur globally in the sunlit hemisphere due to ionospheric disturbance. Critical timing signals begin to destabilize.
T plus 5 minutes. The first piece of core infrastructure to fail is the transoceanic backbone.
GIC induction causes massive voltage spikes in the copper conductors powering the transatlantic and transpacific submarine cables. Safety relays on the critical high-latitude cable strip almost immediately. Europe and North America disconnect almost simultaneously, fracturing the global internet.
T plus 10 minutes. The grid starts to burn.
Massive DC GICs flow into the EHV transformers in high-risk igneous rock zones. The saturation phase begins, generating harmonics and triggering protective relays. Voltage collapse begins regionally across the U.S. Northeast, Quebec, and Scandinavia. This is the widespread destructive phase where physical melting occurs.
T plus 1 hour. The structure of connectivity changes fundamentally.
The global internet effectively ceases to exist. It fractures into dozens of disconnected regional local meshes. International commerce and communication are crippled, reduced to extremely localized, low-capacity systems.
T plus 24 hours, the battery cliff. The localized infrastructure fails.
Cell towers exhaust their limited internal battery backups. Mobile networks go dark across the failure zones, eliminating the primary communication method for the population. GPS timing errors have completely desynchronized any remaining networks. Crucially, LEO satellites begin to experience massive drag, accelerating their orbital decay. Financial markets remain closed and frozen due to the loss of time synchronization.
T plus 72 hours, the diesel cliff. This is the critical transition from infrastructure failure to humanitarian catastrophe.
Data centers run out of fuel and shut down completely. The cloud evaporates, locking out all digital records and services, EHRs, banking access, digital government systems. Water pressure fails in major cities as emergency generator power is exhausted, and sewage backups begin immediately. Supermarket shelves are completely empty, and social order begins to fray due to lack of resources. Hospitals are operating solely on limited emergency power for essential services only.
And the long, agonizing road to recovery, T+1 year.
The main transmission grid remains fundamentally broken due to the sheer number of destroyed, irreplaceable large power transformers. Repair attempts are stymied by the 4-year lead time for new units and the geopolitical freeze on imports. Global GDP has contracted by double-digit percentages. While local communities near power generation sources may have small pockets of electricity, the commercial interconnected web of 2025 is functionally non-existent. Society is in a deep economic and digital reset.
The sources conclude by framing this catastrophe not as an inevitable natural disaster, but as a political and engineering failure, a choice based on prioritizing efficiency over resilience. So what are the clear strategic engineering solutions that exist right now to mitigate this?
The crucial takeaway is the disproportionate cost. The cost of prevention, measured in the tens of billions, is minuscule compared to the potential cost of the event, measured in trillions. The first imperative is large-scale grid hardening.
And what does that look like specifically?
We must install neutral blocking devices, or NBDs, and series capacitors. These devices are designed to block the DC current path of the GICs, preventing them from entering the transformer neutral points and causing saturation. The technology exists, but rapid deployment is slowed by the enormous regulatory hurdle and cost, particularly when you factor in the sheer number of substations that need upgrading.
And addressing the multi-year lead time for LPTs is obviously critical to surviving the repair phase.
It is a national security failure that demands immediate action. We need a federally funded strategic transformer reserve, a large protected stockpile of standardized spare extra high voltage transformers. Standardization is key, so units can be quickly deployed anywhere in the U.S. This circumvents the 4-year manufacturing lead time and eliminates the dependency on potentially hostile international suppliers following a global event.
And what about the failure of the invisible metronome GPS timing?
We require resilient timing. We must deploy hardened terrestrial timing systems that are completely decoupled from vulnerable space assets. Solutions include LRAN, a highly robust, low-frequency radio navigation system, or dedicated fiber-based synchronization rings. This ensures that essential infrastructure, telecom, banking, emergency services can maintain the microsecond precision required for functionality, even when the ionosphere is destroyed.
And finally, ensuring that civilization can run manually when the digital systems fail.
Analog fallbacks. We have allowed complex digital control systems to become the sole operational input for critical infrastructure like water treatment, fuel pumps, and pipelines. These systems must retain the ability to be operated in manual mode or via local non-networked control panels, allowing essential services to continue operating even if the power is limited and the digital supervisory system is fried or inaccessible.
This deep dive has pulled back the curtain on our technological fragility. The digital apocalypse is not a fantastical scenario. It is the inevitable consequence of a solar event meeting a hyper-efficient, fragile physical infrastructure. The simulation makes it clear that the danger is not magically erased data, but the brute force, physical destruction of the hardware, the transformers, the repeaters, and the satellites that powers, cools, and connects that data.
And that is the crux of the issue. We cannot stop the sun. The physics of the solar event are inevitable, but the catastrophic multi-year scope of a resulting societal collapse is entirely self-imposed. We engineered a hyper-efficient system with zero buffer, valuing low cost and convenience above fundamental resilience.
In the gamble against the sun, given the statistics, that 1.6% to 12% decadal risk, the key takeaway here is the long tail. The recovery is measured in years. If the systems we rely on every single day vanish indefinitely, does that efficiency we prioritized turn out to be the most expensive gamble in human history?
The sources suggest that if we continue this course, the house always wins eventually.
A serious thought for you to explore as you consider the hidden dependencies in your world. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep asking questions.